You really think you belong here, old woman? The voice, slick with the unearned confidence of youth and rank, cut through the humid air of the training hall. The crowd of cadets, all sharp angles and identical haircuts, snickered in unison. They parted like a sea of gray uniforms, revealing a lone figure at the center. She stood perfectly still, her focus not on the taunt but on the worn leather strap of her practice rifle, her fingers methodically checking its tension. She offered no reply, no flicker of anger, no sign she had even heard. Her silence was a vacuum, and the antagonist, a cadet sergeant named Price whose jaw seemed permanently set in a sneer, rushed to fill it. He was the Academy's golden boy, the exemplar of its aggressive, chest-thumping ethos, and he saw in this quiet, slightly older female candidate an easy target, a nail to be hammered down to prove his own strength. But from the observation deck high above, the Academy Commandant, General Harding, a man whose eyes had seen 3 decades of real war, leaned forward. He wasn't looking at Price's swagger or the sycophantic laughter of the crowd. He was looking at the woman's stance. It was subtle, a fractional alignment of the feet, a stillness in the hips that spoke not of tension, but of a profound and settled power, a posture he hadn't seen since a dusty airfield in Kandahar. He saw a foundation built on something far heavier than Academy doctrine. If you believe that true strength doesn't need to shout its name, and that respect is earned in the silence between actions, type quiet professional below. The general watched, a forgotten memory stirring, a cold premonition dawning in the pit of his stomach. He knew, with the certainty of a battlefield commander, that the lesson about to be taught on the mats below would not be the one Cadet Price intended to deliver. It would be a lesson in humility paid for in pain, and it would change the very soul of his academy forever. The air in the vast training gymnasium, officially named the Center for Applied Combatives, was thick with the smell of sweat, disinfectant, and the faint metallic tang of ambition. It was a cathedral of controlled violence, a place where the future leaders of the nation's military were forged. On the sprawling expanse of padded blue mats, 200 officer candidates were arranged in a wide semicircle. They were young, almost universally under 25, their bodies honed to a razor's edge, their faces etched with the earnest intensity of those who have memorized the book but have yet to read the world. At their center stood Cadet Sergeant Price, flanked by his 2 ever-present acolytes, Cadets Jennings and Cole. Price was a caricature of military bravado, his chest puffed out so far it seemed to precede him by a full second. He was the product of a system that rewarded volume over substance, aggression over acumen. He moved with a theatrical swagger, his voice a perpetual parade ground bark, and the other cadets orbited him, drawn to the gravity of his self-assurance. His target for today's demonstration was Officer Candidate Thorne, Maya Thorne. She was an anomaly, a disruption in the Academy's carefully curated ecosystem. At 34, she was a decade older than nearly everyone in the room, including some of the junior instructors. Where the others were sharp, loud, and eager, she was quiet, reserved, and observant. Her uniform, though perfectly maintained, seemed to sit on her differently, less a costume of newfound identity and more a simple, functional garment. She had arrived 3 weeks prior with a transfer order so heavily redacted it was mostly black lines, her file designated Special Administrative Entry. This lack of a clear, conventional history made her a ghost, a blank slate onto which the other cadets, led by Price, projected their own insecurities and prejudices. She was the old woman, the mystery meat, the quiet girl in the corner who surely couldn't keep up. Price circled her now, his boots thudding on the edge of the mat. "The purpose of this exercise," he announced, his voice echoing in the cavernous space, "is to demonstrate how to neutralize a non-compliant subject using controlled aggression. It is about establishing dominance. Quickly, decisively." He shared a knowing smirk with Jennings. Some recruits, due to their background or their disposition, lack the necessary spirit for decisive action. They hesitate. They are passive. Today, we will correct that. The insult was clear, a blade wrapped in the language of instruction. Thorn's face remained a mask of placid neutrality. Her gaze was distant, as if she were calculating trajectories in a world far beyond this one. She simply stood in the center of the mat, her hands held loosely at her sides, her breathing slow and even. The junior instructor for the session, a young lieutenant fresh from his own graduation, looked on nervously. He knew Price was crossing a line, turning a training session into a public hazing, but the cadet sergeant's reputation and influence were formidable. The lieutenant's silence was a form of complicity, and it hung in the air, a silent permission for the cruelty to proceed. "Thorn," Price barked, snapping his fingers. "On your knees. You will be the non-compliant subject." It was a deliberate, demeaning order, not part of any standard drill. A few cadets shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. The collective desire not to become Price's next target was stronger than any impulse toward justice. Thorn's expression did not change. She simply lowered herself to her knees, her movements fluid and economical, without a trace of resentment or humiliation. She was an object submitting to a force, a stone settling at the bottom of a river. Her calm was more unnerving than any protest. It infuriated Price. He wanted a reaction. He needed her to crack, to show fear, to validate his dominance. Her serenity was a mirror reflecting his own boorishness, and he couldn't stand it. "Jennings, Cole," he commanded. "You know the drill. Subdue the target." The two cadets moved in, their own arrogance a pale imitation of their leaders. They were bigger than Thorn, heavier, their youth giving them a raw, unrefined strength. They grabbed her arms, intending to twist them into a painful submission hold, to force a cry of pain from her silent lips. They expected resistance, a struggle, the desperate thrashing of a cornered animal. They found something else entirely. They found nothing. Her arms were not tense, not fighting them. They were receptive. It was like trying to grapple with water. The moment they applied force, she yielded, her body flowing with their momentum in a way that subtly unbalanced them, turning their own strength into a liability. The humiliation was meant to be the climax of the setup. The sight of three cadets overpowering one quiet woman was supposed to cement Price's authority. But as their hands closed on her, a strange energy filled the room. The cadets who had been smirking now watched with a new, confused intensity. They were witnessing the prelude to an assault, but the victim refused to play her part. She knelt on the mat, a picture of serene composure, while two strong men struggled to find purchase, their confident smirks beginning to falter into masks of genuine confusion. High above, General Harding leaned closer to the glass, his knuckles white. He recognized that yielding flow. It was Systema, it was Krav Maga, it was a dozen different deadly arts synthesized into something brutally efficient. It was the quiet competence he had seen in the very best operators, the ones who moved through firefights with the same calm Thorn now displayed on a training mat. The academy was a powder keg of assumption and arrogance. And Cadet Sergeant Price, in his profound ignorance, had just lit the fuse. The pressure from Jennings and Cole was meant to be overwhelming, a vice of muscle and bone designed to elicit a quick, panic tap of submission. They twisted her arms, expecting the sharp, upward jerk of a joint reaching its limit, the yelp of pain that would signal their victory. Instead, there was a soft, almost imperceptible shift in Thorn's center of gravity. It was not a reaction, it was an answer. For a fraction of a second, she absorbed their combined force, her body becoming a fulcrum. Then, with a chillingly smooth rotation of her torso, she redirected it. Jennings, who was pulling her left arm, suddenly found himself pulled forward, his own momentum amplified and turned against him. His feet stumbled, his balance shattered, and he was flung past her, landing in a clumsy heap on the mat with a grunt of surprised air. Cole, applying a twisting lock to her right arm, felt the geometry of her body change beneath his hands. Her elbow, which he thought he controlled, dipped and rolled in a way that defied anatomy. His wrist, locked onto hers, was suddenly the weak point. With a movement too quick to follow, not a strike but a precise surgical rotation, Thorne inverted the lock. Cole's own hold became a prison for his hand. A jolt of pure, electric agony shot up his arm as his wrist was bent back at an impossible angle. He cried out, a sharp, involuntary sound that was instantly choked off as Thorne used his compromised posture to guide him face first to the mat. She held him there with a single hand, the pressure on his wrist just enough to ensure total compliance. His face pressed into the blue vinyl, his breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. The entire exchange had taken less than 2 seconds. 2 seconds of fluid, silent, devastatingly efficient motion. The hall, which had been buzzing with smug anticipation, fell into a silence so profound it was like a physical blow. 200 cadets stood frozen, their mouths agape, their minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. They had expected a hazing. They had seen a masterclass. Price, standing a few feet away, was momentarily paralyzed by sheer disbelief. His plan had disintegrated. His authority had vanished. In its place was a cold, terrifying mystery. His 2 lieutenants, his physical extensions of power, had been neutralized by the old woman, as if they were children. Rage, born of humiliation, surged through him. He abandoned any pretense of a training drill and lunged, his hands reaching for her throat, a guttural roar tearing from his lips. It was a raw, undisciplined attack, fueled by ego and fury. For Thorne, it was like the world slowing down. She saw the attack coming not as a threat, but as a simple equation of mass and velocity. As Price's hands came within inches of her neck, she moved. She didn't retreat. She flowed forward, into him, closing the distance. Her left hand came up, not to block, but to gently cup the back of his neck. Her right hand, palm open, met his charging chest. It was not a strike. It was a connection. For an infinitesimal moment, they were linked. Then she pushed. It was not a shove born of muscular strength. All her momentum, all his momentum, all the energy of his furious charge was gathered and focused into a single point on his sternum. The force traveled through his body like a seismic wave. His feet left the ground. His breath was stolen from his lungs in a single, silent gasp. He flew backward, not tumbling, but perfectly horizontal, as if plucked from the air by an invisible hand, and landed flat on his back 5 feet away. The impact knocked the wind from him completely, a sound like a punctured tire. Thorne remained exactly where she was, now standing in the center of the mat. Jennings was scrambling to his feet, his face a mask of fear. Cole was still pinned, whimpering softly. Price lay flat on his back, his eyes wide, staring at the ceiling, trying to remember how to breathe. Thorne's chest rose and fell in the same slow, even rhythm as before. Not a hair was out of place. She had not broken a sweat. She had neutralized 3 aggressive, physically fit cadets, 2 of them simultaneously, in under 5 seconds, without throwing a single punch or kick. The silence in the gymnasium was no longer just an absence of noise. It was a presence. It was heavy, thick with awe and a dawning, terrible respect. Every single cadet, every instructor was looking at the quiet woman in the middle of the mat as if seeing her for the first time. The old woman was gone. The mystery meat had vanished. In her place stood something ancient and dangerous, a quiet professional whose competence was so absolute, it felt like a law of nature. The myth of Cadet Sergeant Price, the Academy's untouchable titan, had just been shattered, and the legend of Officer Candidate Thorne had just been born. The soft, rhythmic clap of hard-soled shoes descending a metal staircase was the only sound that dared to break the spell. Every head turned as General Harding completed his descent from the observation deck and stepped onto the floor of the gymnasium. His face was a granite mask, his eyes sweeping over the scene with an unreadable expression. He didn't look at the stunned cadets lining the walls. He didn't look at Jennings, who was helping a dazed and limping Cole to his feet. He didn't even glance at Price, who was now sitting up, clutching his chest, his face pale with a mixture of pain and profound humiliation. The general's gaze was fixed solely on Maya Thorne. He walked slowly, deliberately, his presence sucking the remaining air from the room, until he stood directly in front of her on the edge of the blue mat. Thorn, in turn, simply stood, her posture relaxed, her hands now clasped loosely behind her back. She met his gaze directly, without challenge, but also without deference. It was the look of one professional acknowledging another. The general held her gaze for a long moment, a silent conversation passing between them that no one else in the room could comprehend. Then, he turned his head slightly toward his aide, a young captain who had scurried down the stairs behind him. "Captain," the general's voice was low, but it carried the effortless authority of command, resonating in the cavernous space. "Bring me Officer Candidate Thorn's service record, the unabridged file." Now, the captain, wide-eyed, simply stammered, "Yes, sir," and sprinted from the gymnasium as if propelled by the order itself. A new wave of whispers rippled through the cadets. The unabridged file. The classified record. The silence returned, heavier this time, pregnant with the weight of revelation. The general stood impassively, a statue of authority, while Thorn waited with the patience of a sniper in a hide. The seconds stretched into minutes. Price finally staggered to his feet, his arrogance completely gone, replaced by a dawning dread. He now understood he had not merely picked a fight with a competent fellow cadet. He had kicked a hornet's nest, and he was only now hearing the buzz. The captain returned, breathless, holding a single, thin, light blue folder marked with stark red lettering. "Top secret //SCI // special access required." He handed it to the general with a trembling hand. General Harding took the folder, his movements precise. He opened it. The only sound was the faint whisper of paper. He scanned the first page, his expression unmoving, but a flicker in his eyes, a tightening at the corner of his mouth, betrayed the gravity of what he was reading. He looked up from the folder, his gaze sweeping over the assembled cadets, finally landing on the pale, shaken face of Cadet Sergeant Price. "Cadet Price," the general began, his voice dangerously calm. "You took it upon yourself to make an example of a fellow candidate. You judge her based on her age, her gender, and her quiet demeanor. You decided she was weak. You assumed she didn't belong." He paused, letting the indictment hang in the air. He then lifted the folder. "I think it's time we all learned who exactly you assaulted today." He cleared his throat, his voice taking on the formal, staccato rhythm of a citation being read. "Thormaya, officer candidate. Age, 34." He let that sink in. "Last held rank, Master Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy." A collective, audible gasp went through the room. A Master Chief, the highest enlisted rank, a figure of legend in any service branch. Price's face went white. "Last unit assignment." The general paused, his eyes narrowing as he read the next line. He looked directly at Thorn, a silent question in his eyes, and received a minuscule, almost imperceptible nod of assent. He turned back to the cadets. Naval Special Warfare Development Group. The name meant nothing to most of the cadets. It was a sterile, bureaucratic title, but the junior instructors and the general himself knew it by its other name, the one whispered in awe and fear in the intelligence community. DevGru, SEAL Team 6. A wave of shock, more profound than before, washed over the instructors. Price, who had enough military knowledge to understand, looked as if he had been physically struck. The general wasn't finished. Combat deploiement, 12. Theaters of operation include Kandahar, Helmand, Al-Anbar, the Horn of Africa. He trailed off, letting the litany of the world's most dangerous places settle. Special skills designators, Master Breacher, Advanced Special Operations Techniques, High Altitude, Low Opening Parachutist, Combat Diver, and Lead Instructor, Advanced Close Quarters Combat. The words fell like hammer blows. Lead Instructor. She didn't just know how to fight. She taught the most elite soldiers on the planet how to do it. The cadets were no longer looking at an older recruit. They were looking at a living, breathing warrior poet, a master of a deadly art they could barely comprehend. The general closed the folder with a soft, final snap. He then did something that no one in that room had ever seen before. General Marcus Harding, a 3-star general, a man who had commanded armies and advised presidents, a figure of immense and unassailable authority, took one step forward, drew himself to his full height, and rendered a slow, sharp, perfect salute to the woman in the simple gray sweatsuit. His movements were crisp, full of a deep and profound respect. The salute wasn't from a general to a candidate. It was from one warrior to another, to a legend. "Master Chief Thorne," the general said, his voice now filled with a reverence that bordered on awe. "On behalf of this institution, my apologies for the unprofessional conduct of my cadets. There is no excuse for it." He held the salute, his arm rigid, his gaze locked on hers. Maya Thorne, for the first time, showed a flicker of a reaction. She raised her own hand in a salute that was equally crisp, equally perfect. "No apology necessary, General," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "They're learning." The image was seared into the memory of every person present. The decorated general saluting the quiet recruit, a silent tableau of earned respect utterly eclipsing the hollow authority of rank and title. The shattered arrogance of Cadet Price was a footnote. The real story was the quiet woman who carried a legacy of silent competence, so vast it had humbled a 3-star general and an entire academy, with nothing more than a few fluid movements and a deafening, disciplined silence. The story of what happened in the Center for Applied Combatives spread, not like wildfire, but like a pressure wave from a distant explosion, silent, invisible, but powerful enough to shake foundations. It wasn't shouted in the mess halls or gossiped about loudly in the barracks. It was spoken of in hushed, reverent tones, in small groups, in the quiet moments between training sessions. The myth of Maya Thorne grew not from exaggeration, but from the stark, unbelievable truth. The name DevGru was whispered like a prayer. The call sign Spectre, which the general's aide had overheard and let slip, became her unofficial title. She was no longer the old woman. She was the Spectre, a ghost who had walked among them, her true nature hidden in plain sight. Her every action was now re-examined, reinterpreted through this new, terrifying lens. Her quietness was no longer seen as passivity, but as the deep, coiled calm of a predator. Her methodical, precise movements were recognized as the ingrained efficiency of a Tier 1 operator. The way she observed every training exercise, her eyes missing nothing, was understood as the constant threat assessment of a woman who had survived a dozen tours in the world's worst places. The institution itself began to react. The junior instructor who had stood by and allowed the hazing to occur was formally reprimanded and reassigned to a desk job, his career permanently stalled. His failure was not in being unable to control Price, but in his inability to recognize the quiet professional standing before him. It became a cautionary tale for all junior officers. General Harding convened a formal inquiry, not for Thorne, but for Price, Jennings, and Cole. The 3 cadets stood before him in his cavernous, flag-draped office, their faces pale, their uniforms seeming ill-fitting and juvenile. They expected to be expelled, their military ambitions turned to ash. The general, however, had a different, more profound lesson in mind. "You 3 represent the single greatest danger to any military force," Harding began, his voice a low rumble of controlled fury. "Not incompetence, arrogance. You confused your rank with respect. You mistook your swagger for strength. You assumed your own superiority based on the most superficial of criteria, and in doing so, you assaulted not just a fellow candidate, but a national asset. A woman to whom men like me owe a debt." He let them stand in the crushing silence. "Expulsion would be an easy lesson. You would leave here blaming her, or me, or the system. You would learn nothing. Your education, however, is not over. It has just begun." Their punishment was a stroke of genius, a piece of psychological warfare that would reshape them far more than any demerits or confinement. For the remainder of their time at the academy, Cadets Price, Jennings, and Cole were assigned to a special remedial training detail in hand-to-hand combat. Their instructor, personally assigned by the general, was Master Chief Thorn. The first session was an exercise in pure humiliation. The three disgraced cadets stood alone on the vast blue mat, the same mat where their world had come apart. Thorn walked in, dressed in the same simple sweats, and looked at them with her calm, unreadable eyes. "The first lesson," she said, her voice soft but carrying absolute authority, "is about assumptions. Assume your opponent is always better than you. Assume they are faster, stronger, and smarter. Assume they have seen more violence than you can imagine. Assume nothing. Prepare for everything." For the next hour, she deconstructed them. She didn't just defeat them, she educated them. With every block, every parry, every joint lock, she would explain the principle behind it. You lead with your chin, Price. It's an invitation. In a real fight, that's a fractured jaw. Jennings, your footwork is clumsy. You're always off balance. You're defeating yourself before I even touch you. Cole, you rely on brute strength. Strength is finite. Structure is infinite. She moved around them, a ghost weaving between their clumsy, telegraphed attacks, neutralizing them with minimal effort. Her voice a constant, quiet stream of devastatingly accurate critique. There was no anger in her instruction, no vengeance. There was only the cold, hard, undeniable truth of her competence. For Price, it was a crucible. The golden boy, the titan of the cadet corps, was reduced to a fumbling novice. But as the weeks went on, something began to change in him. His arrogance, stripped away by the raw truth of his inadequacy, began to be replaced by something else, a deep, profound, and humbling respect. He stopped trying to beat her and started trying to learn from her. His swagger disappeared, replaced by the quiet focus of a true student. He learned to listen. He learned to observe. He learned the difference between the appearance of strength and its reality. The legend of Thorn solidified into academy culture. New cadets would be shown the security footage of the incident, not as a spectacle, but as a core lesson in their leadership development program. The unofficial name for the corner of the mat where Price had been neutralized stuck, Spectre's Corner. To be sent there for remedial training was a mark of shame, a sign that you had let your ego write a check your body couldn't cash. The ripple spread beyond the academy walls. The story, in heavily redacted form, became a talking point at the Pentagon. It was a story of how a system designed to create warriors had almost broken one. It was the story that highlighted the critical need to identify and protect the quiet professionals, the silent assets who moved within the system, often underestimated and overlooked. It was the story that reminded an entire generation of military leaders that the loudest voice in the room is often the weakest, and that true legacy is forged not in boasts, but in the silent, repeated demonstration of undeniable skill. A year later, the sun cast long shadows across the parade ground as the graduating class of the academy stood in perfect formation. Their uniforms were immaculate, their faces a mixture of pride and solemnity. At the podium stood the new cadet commander, the highest-ranking and most respected member of the graduating class. It was a position traditionally held by the most promising, the most assertive, the most exemplary leader. This year, it was the former cadet Sergeant Price. He had been transformed. The sneer was gone, replaced by a quiet gravity. The swagger had been sanded down into a confident stillness. When he stepped up to the microphone to deliver the traditional farewell address, the crowd of families, dignitaries, and fellow cadets fell silent, expecting the usual platitudes about honor and duty. Price looked out over the crowd, his eyes finding General Harding in the front row, and then scanning the faces of his peers. A year ago, he began, his voice steady and clear. I thought I knew what leadership was. I thought it was about being the strongest, the loudest, the one in charge. I thought respect was something you demand. I was wrong. I learned the most important lesson of my time here, not in a classroom or on a battlefield, but on a blue training mat. I learned that true leadership isn't about the noise you make. It's about the competence you demonstrate. I learned that respect isn't demanded. It is earned through quiet, disciplined excellence. He paused, and a hush fell over the parade ground. I was taught this lesson by a Master Chief Petty Officer of the United States Navy, a quiet professional who could have ended my career, but chose to build it instead. She taught me that the most dangerous person in the room is never the one who tells you they are. She taught me that humility is not weakness, is the prerequisite for growth. He never mentioned her name. He didn't have to. Everyone knew. The story was now scripture. Miles away, in a sterile, windowless classroom at a Joint Special Operations Training Facility in Virginia, Maya Thorne watched a live stream of the graduation ceremony on a ruggedized laptop. She was now an instructor in the military's most advanced training programs, a ghost teaching other ghosts. She listened to Price's speech, her face impassive. But as he finished, a small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of her lips. It was a smile of quiet satisfaction. Her lesson had been learned. The seed of quiet competence she had planted in the hard soil of institutional arrogance had taken root. The legacy was not the takedown, not the salute, not the legend. The legacy was the change. It was the transformation of one arrogant cadet into a humble leader. It was the shift in the Academy's culture from prizing bravado to valuing substance. It was the ripple effect of a single, silent demonstration of skill that would now shape thousands of future officers, men and women who would go on to lead with a deeper understanding of respect and the true nature of strength. The story of what happened that day became more than just folklore. It became doctrine. It was proof that one person, armed with nothing but their own undeniable competence and an unwavering commitment to professionalism, could challenge and change a culture. It was a testament to the idea that character is not revealed in the thunder of battle, but in the quiet moments of choice, in the decision to teach rather than punish, to build rather than break. True strength is not the power to dominate, but the discipline to control that power. It is the silent confidence that needs no validation, the skill that speaks for itself through action, not words. The greatest warriors are not the ones who boast of their victories, but the ones whose presence alone commands respect, whose silence is heavier than any threat. They are the quiet professionals, the specters in the system, and their legacy is not written in medals or headlines, but in the lives they change and the standards they set. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance, and where silent discipline defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.